The lights inside the nebula's edge were dim and colorful, casting blue and purple shadows across the crowded room where military personnel from different planets gathered to drink and forget about their missions for a while. The bar sat on an orbital station floating high above New Terra, and it had become the favorite spot for anyone wearing a uniform who needed to relax after months in deep space. The music was loud enough to feel, but not loud enough to drown out conversation, and the smell of alcohol mixed with the recycled air that all space stations seemed to share. Commander Lisa Grant sat alone at the far end of the long metal bar, her dark brown fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey that she sipped slowly while reading reports on her datapad. She had finally returned from 6 months away from civilization, 6 months of work that had drained her mentally and physically, and all she wanted was one quiet drink before heading back to her quarters. Her uniform was crisp and clean, her commander bars polished and visible on her collar, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. She looked tired but satisfied, like someone who had completed a difficult task and lived to tell about it. At the other end of the bar, Captain Jake Sullivan was anything but quiet. He sat with his SEAL team spread across 3 tables they had pushed together, their voices rising above the general noise of the bar as they laughed and drank and told stories about their latest mission. Sullivan was a large man with broad shoulders and a square jaw, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who wanted to make sure everyone knew this was a military man. His chest displayed rows of medals and ribbons from campaigns across the outer colonies, and he wore them with the pride of someone who believed he had earned every single one through blood and sacrifice. His team respected him, feared him a little, and followed him without question. Lieutenant Chris Morgan, one of Sullivan's younger team members, leaned over and nudged his captain's shoulder with his elbow. "Hey, Cap, check out the officer at the bar. Think she's Navy or ground forces?" Morgan was trying to make conversation, trying to keep the mood light, but he didn't realize he was about to set something terrible in motion. Sullivan turned his head and squinted through the dim lighting until his eyes focused on Lisa sitting alone with her drink. He studied her for a moment, taking in her uniform and her relaxed posture, and something in his alcohol-soaked brain decided he needed to go talk to her. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the need to prove something to his team, or maybe it was something darker that he wouldn't admit even to himself. Whatever the reason, he stood up from his table with his glass in hand and walked across the room toward her. His boots made heavy sounds on the metal floor as he approached, and when he reached the bar, he leaned against it with his elbow, positioning himself close enough to Lisa that she couldn't ignore him. "Evening," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been rejected. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." Lisa looked up from her datapad, her expression neutral and controlled. She had dealt with men like this before. Men who thought their rank or their muscles or their medals gave them the right to interrupt someone who clearly wanted to be alone. "That's probably because I just got back from the frontier," she replied, her tone polite but not encouraging. "Frontier, huh? What ship?" Sullivan took a sip of his drink and waited for her answer like he was conducting an interview. "Horizon Dawn, Colonial Reconnaissance." Lisa's answers were short and factual, giving him no openings for further conversation. Sullivan made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. "Reconnaissance. That's what they call observation duty these days. No offense, but that's pretty light work compared to what my boys, and I do." He gestured back toward his table where his team was, watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and concern. Lisa felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice even and professional. Different missions, different objectives. We all serve. She hoped that would be the end of it, that he would take the hint and return to his table and leave her alone. Sure, Sullivan said, waving his hand in a dismissive gesture that made it clear he didn't actually agree with her statement. "But you know what I'm curious about? Your call sign. Every real operator's got one. So what do they call you out there?" He was pushing now, testing her, trying to get some kind of reaction that would prove something to himself, or his watching team. The noise in the bar seemed to drop, slightly as other patrons sensed that something was happening at the end of the counter. Lisa set down her glass very carefully, the way someone does when they're trying to maintain control of their temper. "I don't use a call sign. I'm Commander Lisa Grant, and I go by my rank and name." Sullivan laughed, and this time it was definitely mocking. "Come on now. 6 months in deep space and nobody gave you a nickname? That's hard to believe." Or maybe they did and you just don't want to share it with us ground pounders. His words were starting to slur slightly, the alcohol making him bolder and meaner. I told you my name, Captain. That should be sufficient. Lisa's voice had dropped into a lower register, the kind of tone that should have warned Sullivan he was crossing a line. Sufficient, Sullivan repeated, drawing out the word like it was something ridiculous. He leaned in closer to her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. See, where I come from, operators earn their call signs in the field. Blood, sweat, and rounds downrange. Maybe your problem is you haven't earned one yet. Lisa turned to face Sullivan fully now, abandoning any pretense of being polite or accommodating to his intrusion. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that would have made a smarter man back away immediately. Captain, I suggest you return to your table. I'm not interested in whatever test of masculinity you're trying to perform here. Her words were precise and controlled, each one delivered like a small surgical strike designed to end this conversation without escalating it further. Sullivan's face flushed red, the color spreading from his neck up to his forehead in blotchy patches that made him look like a man on the verge of explosion. In his 15 years of military service, very few people had spoken to him with such direct dismissal, especially not in front of his team who were all watching now with expressions ranging from amusement to concern, his pride already inflated by alcohol and years of being told he was one of the best. Couldn't handle being put in his place by someone he had decided wasn't worthy of respect. Test of masculinity. Lady, I've been in more firefights than you've had hot meals. I'm trying to have a civil conversation here. And you're acting like I insulted your mother. His voice was rising now, drawing even more attention from the other patrons in the bar, who were turning in their seats to watch the confrontation unfold. You're drunk, and you're being disrespectful, Lisa said flatly, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife through paper. Walk away. It wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was a command delivered by someone who was used to being obeyed. The entire bar had gone silent now, all conversations dying away as people realized they were about to witness something significant. Sullivan's team members had stopped drinking, their hands frozen halfway to their mouths or resting motionless on the table. Even the bartender, a grizzled veteran named Pete who had seen countless bar fights and arguments in his years running this establishment, had stopped wiping glasses to observe what was happening. Sullivan's anger reached its boiling point, fueled by alcohol and wounded pride and something darker that lived in the depths of his assumptions about the world. Disrespectful? I'm disrespectful? You sit here with your fancy commander bars, probably got them through some diversity quota, and you've got the nerve to... The words were spilling out of him now, ugly and revealing, exposing prejudices that he probably didn't even know he carried until the alcohol stripped away his filters. He never finished the sentence because his rage took physical form before his brain could stop it. In a moment of pure alcohol-fueled stupidity, Sullivan threw his drink directly at Lisa's face. The amber liquid flew through the air in what seemed like slow motion to everyone watching, splashing across her dark skin and soaking into her uniform, while ice cubes clattered against the bar and fell to the floor. Lisa sat frozen for a moment that stretched out forever, whiskey dripping from her chin and running down her neck to stain the collar of her military jacket. The entire bar seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, whether she would scream or strike back or simply walk away. Instead, she reached for a napkin with movements that were slow and deliberate and terrifyingly controlled, wiping her face clean, while her eyes never left Sullivan's face. When she looked up at him, her gaze was cold as the vacuum of space outside the station walls. You just made the worst mistake of your military career, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room despite its low volume. There was no anger in her tone, no rage or desire for revenge, just a simple statement of fact delivered by someone who knew exactly what consequences were about to fall on the man standing in front of her. Pete, the bartender, was already reaching for his communicator with hands that had probably made this call 100 times before. Station security's been notified. Nobody move. His voice had the authority of someone who ran his establishment with clear rules that everyone was expected to follow. Sullivan seemed to realize what he had done, his face paling slightly as the alcohol fog cleared just enough for reality to break through, but his pride still wouldn't let him back down or apologize. She provoked me. You all saw it. He looked around the bar seeking support or validation, but found only shocked faces and disapproving stares from people who had watched the whole interaction. and knew exactly who was at fault. Chris Morgan had pushed away from the team table and made his way over, his young face tight with worry as he tried to salvage the situation. "Cap, we need to go, now." He reached for Sullivan's arm, but the captain shook him off, still standing there dripping with self-righteousness and refusing to accept what was happening. But it was too late for escape or excuses because the door to the bar opened and 2 station security officers entered, their hands resting on their sidearms in a gesture that was casual but unmistakably threatening. They moved with the confidence of people who dealt with drunk military personnel every single night and knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Behind them, something unexpected happened that changed everything. The door opened again and Admiral Richard Hayes walked in. Still wearing his dress uniform from a diplomatic function he had been attending somewhere else on the station. His presence was like a gravitational field that pulled everyone's attention, his 4 stars gleaming even in the dim bar lighting, his face carrying the expression of someone who had just walked into a situation he didn't want to deal with, but would handle with absolute authority. The Admiral took one long look at the scene in front of him, his eyes moving from Lisa Grant sitting at the bar soaking wet with whiskey still dripping from her uniform, to Jake Sullivan standing there with his empty glass still in his hand, to the crowd of watching military personnel who all suddenly found reasons to look at their drinks or the floor or anywhere except at him. His expression turned to stone, the kind of cold anger that was far more frightening than any amount of yelling could ever be. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Admiral Richard Hayes surveyed the frozen scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 30 years in military service watching people make terrible decisions and then having to clean up the consequences. His presence had transformed what was already a serious incident into something that would have lasting repercussions, and everyone in the bar knew it. The security officers stood at attention despite being station personnel rather than fleet, their respect for rank overriding any other considerations. Pete the bartender spoke up first, his voice steady and professional as he delivered his account. "Admiral, Captain Sullivan here threw his drink at Commander Grant. Unprovoked assault, sir. I've got the whole thing on security footage if you need to review it." He gestured toward the cameras mounted in the corners of the bar, their red lights blinking steadily as they recorded everything. Hayes turned his full attention to Sullivan, who suddenly looked far less confident than he had moments before when he thought he was dealing with just another commander and some station security guards. "Is this true, Captain?" The Admiral's question was simple but carried the weight of judgment behind it. Sullivan straightened his posture, trying desperately to salvage some dignity from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "Sir, there was a disagreement. Things got heated. The commander was being insubordinate and he was trying to spin the story, trying to make it sound like Lisa had somehow provoked him or acted inappropriately, but Hayes cut him off before he could continue." "Insubordinate?" Hayes interrupted, his voice dropping into that dangerously quiet register that experienced officers knew meant someone was about to have their career destroyed. "Captain, do you know who you just assaulted?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Sullivan faltered, his prepared excuses dying in his throat as he realized there was something happening here that he didn't understand. "She said her name was Lisa Grant, a commander on some colonial recon ship." He gestured vaguely toward Lisa as if that explained everything. Hayes walked over to Lisa with measured steps, his dress shoes clicking on the metal floor in the silent bar. "Commander Grant, are you injured?" His tone was respectful and concerned, treating her with the deference that Sullivan should have shown from the beginning. "No, Admiral, just wet and moderately insulted." Lisa's response was calm and professional despite the whiskey still soaking her uniform, her composure under these circumstances revealing more about her character than any amount of medals ever could. Hayes nodded once, then turned back to Sullivan with an expression that made several people in the bar actually take a step backward. The Admiral's next words dropped like bombs into the silent room, each sentence an explosion that shattered Sullivan's worldview piece by piece. "Captain Sullivan, allow me to properly introduce Commander Lisa Grant. She's not just any reconnaissance officer. Commander Grant is the first human to successfully negotiate a peace treaty with the Gentari Collective, ending a conflict that had claimed over 40,000 colonial lives." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "She's a recipient of the Star of Valor, the Colonial Service Cross, and the Diplomatic Excellence Medal. She's also fluent in 7 alien languages and holds 3 doctoral degrees in xenolinguistics, astrophysics, and military strategy. Sullivan's face went from red to white so fast it looked like someone had drained all the blood from his head. His mouth opened and closed, but no sounds came out as he processed what he was hearing. Each new piece of information hammering another nail into the coffin of his assumptions. Hayes wasn't finished, his voice gaining intensity as he continued to dismantle Sullivan in front of everyone. Her light observation duty, as you so eloquently put it, consisted of spending 6 months alone in Jantari space, surrounded by a species that considers humans little more than intelligent vermin, convincing them through sheer force of intellect and courage that we deserved to exist. She did this while knowing that one wrong word, one cultural misstep, could spark a genocide that would wipe out every human colony in 3 sectors. The bar was utterly silent now except for the sound of someone's glass being set down too hard on a table. Sullivan's team members were staring at their captain with expressions that ranged from horror to shame to disgust, realizing that the man they followed had just revealed himself to be exactly the kind of prejudiced fool they had hoped he wasn't. Lisa stood up from her bar stool, brushing ice cubes from her uniform with hands that remained steady, despite everything that had just happened. "Admiral, if I may, I'd rather not make this a bigger incident than it needs to be. The captain had too much to drink and made a poor choice. It happens." Her willingness to minimize the situation spoke to a generosity of spirit that made Sullivan's actions look even worse by comparison. "That's very gracious of you, Commander," Hayes said, his tone making it clear that while he appreciated her sentiment, he had no intention of letting this slide. "But assault of a superior officer is not something I can overlook, regardless of your personal feelings on the matter." He was drawing a line, making it clear that this was about more than just Lisa's hurt feelings or damaged uniform. Sullivan's mouth fell open again, as his brain struggled to process another impossible piece of information. "Superior officer? She's a commander. I'm a captain." He said it like he was pointing out an obvious error, like surely the admiral had made a mistake in his understanding of military ranks. Hayes smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Only the cold satisfaction of watching someone's arrogance crumble under the weight of their own ignorance. "Navy Commander Captain Sullivan, which, as you should know from your basic military training, is equivalent to a lieutenant colonel in your ranking system. She outranks you by 2 full grades." He let that information settle for a moment before adding, "So not only did you assault a decorated war hero and accomplished diplomat, you assaulted a superior officer while drunk and in front of witnesses." The implications crashed down on Sullivan like a physical weight. The security officers moved forward with the intention of taking Sullivan into custody, right there in front of everyone. But Admiral Hayes held up one hand in a gesture that stopped them in their tracks. "Give us a moment, gentlemen." His voice carried the kind of authority that made people obey without question, even when they weren't under his direct command. The security officers stepped back but remained alert and ready. Hayes gestured toward a corner of the bar that was slightly more private, away from the watching crowd that had turned this incident into the evening's entertainment. "Captain Sullivan, Commander Grant, come with me." It wasn't a request, despite being phrased politely, and both officers followed him across the room. Chris Morgan took a step as if to follow, but Hayes stopped him with a single look that made it clear this conversation was for the principals only. Once they were far enough from the crowd that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by everyone in the bar, Hayes folded his arms across his chest and fixed Sullivan with a stare that had probably broken stronger men than him. "Captain Sullivan, you have 2 options, and I suggest you listen very carefully before making your choice." He paused to make sure Sullivan was paying attention, despite the alcohol still clouding his judgment. "Option 1. I file formal charges against you. Assault of a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and given the racial implications of your earlier comments that I heard as I was walking in, we'll add discrimination and prejudice to the list. You'll face a court-martial within the month. You'll lose your command immediately, and you'll likely spend time in a military prison before being dishonorably discharged. Your 15 years of service, all your medals, everything you've built will be erased, and you'll leave the military in disgrace." Hayes delivered this option in a flat, factual tone that made it clear this wasn't a threat but simply a description of what would happen. Sullivan's face had gone from white to gray, all the color draining away as he understood exactly what was being laid out in front of him. His career, his identity, everything he had built his life around was suddenly balanced on a knife edge. And the hand holding that knife belonged to the woman he had just assaulted. Option 2, Hayes continued after letting option 1 sink in for a moment. Commander Grant agrees to accept a formal apology from you. You spend the next 30 days in the brig for drunk and disorderly conduct, which will go on your permanent record. You undergo mandatory counseling and sensitivity training for 6 months. You'll also be suspended from active duty during that period, pending a full psychological evaluation to determine if you're fit to continue leading men. He laid out each consequence clearly, making sure Sullivan understood that even the merciful option came with serious repercussions. Hayes turned to Lisa, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her. Commander, this is your call to make. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and you have every right to press full charges and see this man court-martialed. No one would blame you, and I'll support whatever decision you make without question. He was giving her real power here, not just the illusion of choice, but actual authority to decide Sullivan's fate. Lisa looked at Sullivan for a long moment, studying his face, which now showed fear mixing with the remnants of his earlier anger and pride. She could see his entire career hanging in the balance, could see the reality of consequences finally breaking through his alcohol-soaked arrogance. She had the power to destroy him with a single word, to end everything he had worked for, and part of her wanted to do exactly that because people like him had been making her life harder since the day she joined the military. Why did you do it? She asked quietly, her voice carrying none of the judgment that Hayes had used, but instead a genuine curiosity. What about me sitting at that bar made you feel like you needed to prove something? She wasn't asking as a superior officer or as someone seeking an apology, but as one human being trying to understand another. Sullivan opened his mouth and then closed it again, his brain struggling to form words that would explain something he didn't fully understand himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and rough. I don't know. I saw you sitting there, confident and calm and completely comfortable in your own space, and I felt like I needed to test you. To see if you were really qualified or just... He couldn't finish the sentence because finishing it would mean saying the ugly truth out loud. Just promoted because of my skin color? Lisa finished for him, her voice still quiet but now carrying an edge of steel. Because I'm a black woman in a command position? And that doesn't fit your worldview of who gets to be a hero or who deserves respect? She was forcing him to confront the prejudice that had driven his actions, making him look directly at the ugliness he had been carrying around. Sullivan looked down at his feet, unable to meet her eyes as shame finally began to crack through his defensive anger. I served with good people. People who died for this uniform, who gave everything they had. And sometimes I see officers who I think didn't earn their place through merit. And it makes me angry because I feel like it disrespects the people who actually bled for their rank. He was trying to explain himself, trying to make it sound reasonable, but even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how hollow they sounded. But that's not an excuse, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. I was wrong. I was drunk and stupid and wrong about you, wrong about everything. I made assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudices, and then I acted on those assumptions in the worst possible way. It was the closest he had come to a real apology, an admission of fault that wasn't couched in excuses or deflections. Yes, you were wrong, Lisa agreed, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. But here's what you're going to learn, Captain, assuming you get the chance to learn anything from this. The universe is bigger than your prejudices. We're out here encountering species who make humans look primitive, who could wipe us out with a thought or a decision. The only thing keeping us alive is our ability to think, to adapt and to work together despite our differences. Lisa continued speaking, her voice carrying the weight of experience that Sullivan was only beginning to understand. Every single one of us, regardless of what we look like or where we come from, has to contribute if humanity is going to survive out here. Your skills in combat operations matter. My skills in diplomacy matter. And neither one is more important than the other because we need both. She was teaching him something fundamental that his 15 years of service had somehow failed to instill. She turned to Admiral Hayes. Having made her decision, I'll accept option 2, Admiral, but I want to add a condition. Captain Sullivan will attend one of my debriefing sessions about the Gentari negotiations. I want him to understand exactly what light observation duty actually means when you're dealing with species that could end humanity. It was a generous offer that gave Sullivan a chance at redemption while also ensuring he would be educated about his ignorance. Hayes nodded with an expression that might have been approval or relief. Agreed. Captain Sullivan, you're officially confined to quarters pending transfer to the brig. Security will escort you back to your assigned lodgings. You should consider yourself fortunate that Commander Grant is a better person than you gave her credit for. And you should spend your time in confinement, thinking about how you're going to prove you deserve the second chance she just gave you. He gestured to the security officers who moved forward to flank Sullivan. Sullivan stood at attention, his training overriding everything else as he prepared to be taken into custody. Before the security officers could lead him away, he looked at Lisa one more time. Thank you, Commander. I don't deserve your mercy, but I won't waste it. His voice was sincere now, stripped of all the earlier bravado and arrogance. Just a man who had looked into the abyss of losing everything and been pulled back from the edge. As Sullivan was escorted out of the bar with Chris Morgan and the rest of his team following at a distance, the crowd of watching personnel began to disperse and return to their drinks and conversations. The incident was over, but the story would spread through the station and beyond, becoming part of military lore in ways that none of them could predict. Pete, the bartender, approached Lisa with a clean towel. Commander, I'm sorry that happened in my establishment. That kind of behavior isn't tolerated here. He seemed genuinely upset that someone had been assaulted in his bar, his professional pride wounded by Sullivan's actions. Not your fault. Pete, you can't control what drunk people do, you can only control how you respond. And you responded perfectly. Lisa took the towel and began cleaning the remaining whiskey from her hands and arms. Her movements tired now that the adrenaline was fading. Hayes waited until most of the crowd had returned to their business before speaking to Lisa in a lower voice. That was well handled, Commander. A lot of officers would have thrown the book at him, and they would have been justified. He seemed genuinely impressed by her decision to offer mercy rather than punishment. Maybe, Lisa replied, but I meant what I said to the Gentari during the negotiations. Humans survive through cooperation despite our differences, not through punishment and division. If I'm going to preach that philosophy to aliens, I need to practice it with my own species, even when they don't deserve it. She finished cleaning herself and handed the towel back to Pete. Hayes smiled slightly, the first real warmth he'd shown since entering the bar. You've given that man a gift whether he realizes it yet or not. The question is whether he'll use it to become better or whether he'll waste it feeling sorry for himself. It was a prediction and a challenge, acknowledging that Lisa's mercy only meant something if Sullivan actually changed. We'll find out, Lisa said simply. She gathered her datapad and prepared to leave, wanting nothing more than to get back to her quarters and change into dry clothes. The next morning arrived too early for everyone involved in the previous night's incident. Lisa Grant stood in the station's main briefing room, preparing for what had become an unexpected obligation, but one she took seriously. Admiral Hayes had used his authority to fast-track Sullivan's mandatory attendance at her debriefing, scheduling it before the captain's official transfer to the brig. The room was designed to hold about 50 people, with rows of seats facing a large holographic display system that could project images and data in 3 dimensions. The room gradually filled with officers, diplomats, and intelligence personnel who had been waiting weeks for a chance to hear Lisa's first-hand account of the Gentari negotiations. These were people who understood the significance of what she had accomplished, who knew that preventing a war with the Gentari had saved not just 40,000 lives but potentially millions if the conflict had escalated. They took their seats with notebooks and recording devices, ready to absorb every detail. Sullivan entered last, escorted by a security officer who took position by the door. The captain looked terrible, his face pale and haggard from either hangover or shame or probably both. He wore a clean uniform, but his eyes were bloodshot and his hands trembled slightly as he took a seat in the back row, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. Several officers recognized him from the bar incident, and their expressions ranged from sympathy to disgust as they watched him sit down. Lisa began her presentation without acknowledging Sullivan specifically, addressing the room as a whole with the confidence of someone who had survived something extraordinary and lived to share the lessons. How many of you have ever been in a situation where every word you spoke could result in the death of billions? She let the question hang in the air, watching as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats because they all knew the answer was none of them. 6 months ago, I was sent to the Gentari home system with a simple mission: prevent a war. The Gentari had intercepted one of our colonial expeditions in what they considered sacred space. They'd destroyed 3 of our ships with all hands lost and were preparing to launch a full-scale assault on our frontier colonies. She activated the holographic display and an image appeared, showing the insectoid features of the Gentari. The holographic Gentari that appeared in the center of the room was nightmarish to look at, all sharp angles and chitinous armor plates that seemed designed to inspire fear in anything that saw them. Their bodies were roughly humanoid but wrong in every detail. With 4 arms that ended in blade-like appendages, legs that bent backwards at the knee, and heads that were more insect than anything else with multifaceted eyes that reflected light in disturbing ways. Several people in the audience visibly recoiled from the image even though they knew it was just a projection. The Gentari don't think like us, Lisa continued, manipulating the display to show different angles of the alien species. Their society is based on a hive structure where individual life has literally no meaning. Only the survival and success of the collective matters. To them, our emphasis on individual rights and freedoms was not just incomprehensible, it was offensive and dangerous. They saw us as chaotic animals who couldn't control our own members and therefore represented a threat to order in the galaxy. She spoke calmly, but everyone could hear the underlying tension in her voice as she described beings who had held her life in their clawed hands for 6 months. She clicked through more images showing her arrival at the Gentari flagship, a massive vessel that looked like it had been grown rather than built with organic curves mixed with metallic surfaces. I was alone on their vessel for 2 weeks before they even acknowledged my presence. They were testing me, trying to understand if I could grasp their language and their concepts. Human mouths aren't designed to make their sounds. We don't have the right vocal structures or the ability to produce the pheromone signals they use for emotional communication. She showed images of the translation device she'd had to wear, a complex piece of technology that wrapped around her throat and connected to implants behind her ears. I had to learn 3 separate communication systems simultaneously. Their vocal language, which required the translation device, their gestural communication, which involved precise movements of all 4 arms in specific patterns, and their pheromone signaling, which the device could produce but which I had to learn to control consciously, since humans don't naturally communicate that way. As she spoke, she demonstrated some of the gestures, her arms moving in ways that looked unnatural and uncomfortable. Sullivan watched from the back row, his eyes fixed on Lisa as she described challenges that made his combat missions look simple by comparison. He was beginning to understand exactly how badly he had misjudged her, how completely his assumptions had blinded him to reality. The breakthrough came when I realized they weren't seeing us as individuals at all, Lisa explained. They were seeing humanity as a single chaotic hive that couldn't coordinate its own members. Every time we talked about individual humans making different choices or disagreeing with each other, they interpreted it as a sign of weakness and failure. So I did something risky, something that could have backfired catastrophically. She paused, making sure everyone was paying attention to what came next. I claimed that I spoke for the human collective, that I was our equivalent of their hive queen, the single consciousness that guided all of humanity's actions. It was a complete lie, of course. Humans don't have a collective consciousness, and we never will because our strength comes from our diversity of thought. But it was the only frame of reference they could understand, the only way to make them see me as someone worth negotiating with rather than just another confused individual from a broken hive. The admission caused murmurs throughout the room because lying in diplomatic negotiations was risky at best and potentially disastrous. For the next 5 months, I had to maintain that fiction perfectly. I couldn't slip even once, couldn't reveal that humans act independently and make our own choices, because the moment they realized I was lying about speaking for all humanity, they would have classified us as a pest species to be exterminated for the good of galactic order. Lisa's voice was steady, but everyone could hear the strain underneath, the weight of carrying that deception for so long while knowing that billions of lives depended on her performance. She showed footage of the negotiation sessions, tense encounters where multiple Gentari surrounded her in their council chamber, with its strange architecture that seemed designed to disorient human senses. The aliens moved in perfect synchronization, their gestures and pheromone signals creating a symphony of communication that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Lisa sat alone in the center of it all, a single human surrounded by beings who could have killed her without effort, defending the right of humanity to exist through nothing but words and ideas. The hardest part wasn't the language or the isolation, or even the constant fear, Lisa said quietly. It was the knowledge that if I failed, if I couldn't make them understand why humanity deserved to survive, millions would die, and it would be my fault. Every morning I woke up on that ship. I had to convince myself that I had the right to speak for humanity, even though I knew I didn't. I had to believe I could do this impossible thing because if I didn't believe it, they would sense my doubt through the pheromone signals and everything would fall apart. A junior officer raised her hand tentatively. Commander, how did you convince them to accept us? What argument finally worked? It was the question everyone wanted answered, the key to understanding how Lisa had achieved the impossible. I reframed what it means to be human, Lisa replied. The Gentari concept of strength is tied to unity of purpose and action. Everyone in the hive working toward the same goal in perfect coordination. When I presented our human values like individual freedom and personal choice, they saw it as weakness and chaos. So I showed them that human diversity, our ability to disagree and still cooperate, was actually a different kind of strength. She manipulated the display to show charts and graphs comparing human and Gentari approaches to problem solving. I explained that while they had one hive mind making decisions, we had billions of minds working on problems simultaneously. Different perspectives, different solutions, all contributing to human survival in ways that a single consciousness couldn't match. Lisa looked directly at Sullivan for the first time since beginning her presentation, her eyes finding him in the back row where he sat trying to disappear into his seat. I told them that our greatest strength wasn't our unity of thought, but our unity of purpose despite our differences. That a human scientist and a human soldier, a human from Earth and a human from the colonies, a black woman and a white man, could all work toward the same goal of human survival, while approaching it from completely different angles. I told them that this diversity of approach made us more adaptable, more resilient, more capable of surviving in a hostile galaxy than any single consciousness could ever be. The room was silent as people absorbed her words and realized she was teaching a lesson that went far beyond alien negotiations. She was talking about the incident in the bar without ever mentioning it directly, making her point through the story of how she had saved humanity by embracing the very differences that Sullivan had used to judge her. The treaty we negotiated isn't just a ceasefire or a temporary peace, Lisa continued, breaking eye contact with Sullivan to address the room again. It's a framework for coexistence between two species that think in fundamentally different ways. The Gentari agreed to recognize human space and human sovereignty as legitimate. We agreed to respect their sacred zones and to establish cultural exchange programs so both species could learn from each other. She showed the actual treaty document, pages of text in both human languages and the complex written form of Gentari communication. Admiral Hayes stood from his seat in the front row, drawing everyone's attention. Commander Grant's work has been classified at the highest levels until today. The reason we're revealing it now is because the Gentari have formally requested her return to their space as a permanent ambassador. They want her to establish the first human embassy on their homeworld. His announcement caused excited murmurs throughout the room because permanent diplomatic relations with the Gentari meant humanity had truly been accepted as equals rather than just tolerated. Lisa nodded, acknowledging information she had been sitting on for days. They want me to leave military service and take on a civilian diplomatic role. It would mean living among the Gentari full-time, serving as the bridge between our species for the foreseeable future. I haven't made my final decision yet, but I'm leaning toward accepting because I believe I can do more good there than anywhere else. She spoke matter-of-factly about a decision that would reshape her entire life, treating it like just another mission assignment, rather than the massive sacrifice it represented. The briefing continued for another hour, with Lisa answering detailed questions about Gentari culture, technology, military capabilities, and diplomatic protocols. She shared information that would be vital for any future human interactions with the species, creating a knowledge base that hadn't existed before her mission. Throughout it all, Sullivan sat in the back row taking notes with shaking hands, his earlier arrogance completely destroyed by the weight of what he was learning. When the briefing finally ended and people began filing out, discussing what they'd learned and making plans to incorporate it into their own work, Sullivan remained in his seat. The security officer by the door looked uncertain, but Lisa gestured that it was all right for the captain to stay. She waited until the room was empty except for the three of them before approaching Sullivan's row. "Walk with me, Captain," she said. Not an order, but not quite a request either. The security officer followed at a discreet distance as they left the briefing room and walked through the station corridors, toward the brig where Sullivan would be spending the next 30 days. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing on the metal floors while other personnel moved past them on their own business. Finally, Sullivan spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Commander, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, though I'm not sure I have one that makes any sense even to myself." He kept his eyes forward rather than looking at her, as if meeting her gaze would be too much to bear. "Try," Lisa said simply, giving him space to find his words. Sullivan took a deep breath that shuddered in his chest. "I've spent 15 years in the SEALs. I've led men into combat situations where we faced death every single day. I've lost friends, good people who gave everything for the mission and for each other. I earned every commendation on my chest through blood and pain and sacrifice. My entire identity, my whole sense of self-worth, is wrapped up in being one of the best operators humanity has to offer." He was trying to explain himself, struggling to find words for feelings he'd probably never examined before. "Then I come to this station," he continued, "and I see someone like you, someone who accomplished more in 6 months than I have in my entire career, and I just couldn't handle it. It challenged everything I thought I knew about what makes a soldier valuable, what makes someone worthy of respect and recognition." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "So you tried to diminish me?" Lisa said, not accusingly but as a simple statement of fact. "You tried to make yourself feel superior by convincing yourself I didn't earn my position, that my accomplishments were somehow less real than yours." She was helping him see his own motivations clearly, forcing him to confront what he'd done. "Yes," Sullivan admitted, the word coming out like a confession, "and the alcohol stripped away whatever filters I normally have. I saw you, a black woman, sitting there so confident and self-assured, and every prejudice I thought I'd moved past came rushing back. I wanted to prove you were less than me, that my way of serving was more important than yours, that I somehow deserved more respect." He was finally being completely honest, tearing down his own defenses and examining the ugliness underneath. Lisa stopped walking and turned to face him, forcing Sullivan to meet her eyes. "You know what the Gentari taught me, Captain? They taught me that difference isn't weakness, it's survival. Their entire species thinks and acts as one, perfect unity and coordination. And they were on the verge of destroying us because they couldn't comprehend that humans are different from each other. But I convinced them that our differences make us stronger, that diversity of thought and approach is an advantage rather than a flaw." She stepped closer to Sullivan, her voice intense but not angry. "You and I are different. Different backgrounds, different experiences, different specialties. But we're both serving the same cause of human survival in a galaxy that's bigger and more dangerous than most people can imagine. Your skills in combat operations are just as vital as my skills in diplomacy. Neither is more important than the other because we need both if we're going to survive out here." She was teaching him the same lesson she'd taught the Gentari, that diversity of capability was humanity's greatest strength. "I understand that intellectually now," Sullivan said quietly. "Sitting in that briefing room, listening to what you went through, seeing actual proof of what you accomplished. I understand it in my head. But there's clearly a gap between intellectual understanding and actual belief, between knowing something and feeling it in your bones. Otherwise, I wouldn't have acted the way I did in that bar." He was being honest about his own limitations, acknowledging that awareness wasn't the same as change. "Then close that gap," Lisa replied firmly. "You're going to the brig and you're going to counseling. Use that time, Captain. Really examine why you felt threatened by me. Why seeing a successful black woman in command made you need to prove something. Because I guarantee you, if humanity is going to survive in this galaxy surrounded by species that could destroy us on a whim, we cannot afford to have soldiers who judge their comrades by skin color or gender instead of capability." Her words were harsh but fair, demanding that he do the difficult work of actually changing rather than just feeling sorry. Sullivan nodded slowly, accepting the challenge she was laying before him. "Commander, will you consider one request? After I've done my time in the brig, after I've completed the mandatory counseling and shown real progress, would you be willing to meet with me again? I'd like the chance to prove that I can be better than the person you met in that bar." It was a humble request from a man who had lost all his arrogance. Lisa studied him carefully, looking for signs of sincerity versus manipulation. She had seen enough people in her life to know that remorse in the moment didn't always translate to actual change over time. "Maybe," she said finally, not committing but not rejecting him entirely. "But you'll have to earn it, Captain. Just like you said, everyone should earn their place and their recognition. You want my respect and my willingness to believe you've changed? Show me through your actions over time, not through words or promises." She was holding him to the same standard he had tried to hold her to, turning his own logic back on him. They had reached the brig entrance, where the security officer who had been following them prepared to hand Sullivan over to the facility guards. Sullivan stood at attention and saluted Lisa properly, his form perfect despite everything. "Commander Grant, thank you for your mercy and your honesty." "I won't waste either one." His voice was steady and sincere, the voice of a man who had been broken down and was beginning to rebuild himself. Lisa returned the salute, acknowledging him as a fellow officer despite everything that had happened. "See that you don't, Captain." Dismissed. She watched as he was led through the security checkpoint into the brig facility, disappearing from view as the doors closed behind him. Admiral Hayes had been waiting nearby, observing the interaction from a respectful distance. He approached Lisa once Sullivan was gone. "That was generous of you, Commander," giving him hope for redemption. Some people would say he doesn't deserve it after what he did. He wasn't criticizing her choice, just acknowledging the difficulty of showing mercy to someone who had wronged her so badly. "Maybe he doesn't deserve it," Lisa agreed. "But I meant what I said to the Gentari and what I just said to Sullivan. Humans survive through cooperation despite our differences. If I'm going to preach that philosophy to aliens, I need to practice it with my own species even when it's hard, even when the person doesn't seem to deserve a second chance." She was being consistent with her own values, walking the walk rather than just talking the talk. Hayes smiled with genuine warmth. "You're going to make an excellent ambassador, Commander. Have you made your final decision about accepting the position?" He already seemed to know what her answer would be, but asked anyway out of respect for the process. Lisa looked out a nearby window at the stars that filled the black void of space, countless points of light representing worlds and possibilities that humanity was only beginning to explore. "I think I have, Admiral. The Gentari need someone who understands them, but who will also stand up for human values and human rights. I can do more good there, building bridges between species, than I can anywhere else. The fleet will survive without me." She spoke with the certainty of someone who had found their true purpose. "The fleet will miss you," Hayes corrected gently, "but you're right that this is where you're needed most." "When do you plan to leave?" He was already thinking about logistics and transition plans, the practical matters that would need to be handled. 2 weeks. I need to finalize some reports, brief my replacement on the Horizon Dawn, and prepare myself mentally for what's going to be a very long assignment in an environment where I'll be the only human. Lisa was treating it like any other mission, assignment, even though it represented a complete transformation of her life. 3 months later, Lisa Grant stood in her new quarters on the Gentari homeworld, surrounded by the alien architecture and atmosphere that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The embassy building was a compromise between human and Gentari design preferences, with rooms that felt almost familiar, but were strange in subtle ways that reminded her constantly that she was far from home. Through the window, she could see the hive cities spreading across the landscape, geometric structures that housed millions of Gentari in their perfect synchronized society. Her personal communicator chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Hayes. She opened it and found herself smiling at what she read. Captain Jake Sullivan had completed his counseling sessions and his time in the brig, and his evaluation reports showed genuine progress rather than just going through the motions. His counselor had recommended his return to duty with certain conditions and ongoing monitoring. More interesting was the attached note explaining that Sullivan had requested a transfer to the Colonial Integration Office, specifically asking to work with diverse human populations on frontier worlds where people from different backgrounds had to learn to cooperate. He had included a personal message that Lisa read twice. Commander Grant, I wanted you to know that I took your words seriously. I've spent the last 3 months examining my own biases and prejudices, really digging into why I felt threatened by your success and why I needed to diminish you. I've been working with a counselor to understand the unconscious racism and sexism I was carrying around. I may never fully undo the damage of a lifetime of unexamined prejudice, but I'm committed to trying every single day. I'm requesting assignment to work with populations I previously dismissed or underestimated. If I'm going to serve humanity, I need to serve all of humanity, not just the parts that look like me or think like me. Thank you for showing me that there was a better way. Captain Jake Sullivan. Lisa thought for a moment before composing her reply, keeping it brief but sincere. Captain Sullivan, I'm pleased to see you taking responsibility for your growth and your education. The real test will be in your continued actions over months and years, not in your words or your intentions right now. Prove through service that you've learned something. Commander Lisa Grant. She hit send and then returned to unpacking her belongings. A Gentari aide entered her quarters, their chitinous form, moving with the precise efficiency that characterized everything their species did. Through her translation device that she wore constantly now, they communicated in the complex mixture of sound and gesture that made up their language. Ambassador Grant, the Hive Council requests your presence. There is a matter involving human colonists who have entered disputed space that requires your input and mediation. The translator converted their communication into words Lisa could understand while preserving the emotional context carried in their pheromone signals. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Lisa replied in Gentari, her translation device humming as it converted her words and intentions into the proper signals. She had gotten much better at using it over the months, learning to think in ways that would translate properly rather than just speaking English and hoping the device would figure it out. As she prepared to leave for the Hive Council chambers, she caught her reflection in a polished metal surface that served as a mirror. She thought about that night in the Nebula's Edge bar, about Sullivan's drink splashing across her face, about the shock and anger and the choice she had made in that moment. She could have destroyed his career with a word, could have let rage and justified anger guide her decision. Instead, she had chosen to see an opportunity for education and growth, both for Sullivan and for the military culture that had produced his prejudice. The galaxy was full of conflicts waiting to happen, misunderstandings that could explode into violence if not handled carefully, whether it was between humans and Gentari, or between humans who looked different from each other.